In legacy environments, it was considered enough that you have an application deployed in, let's say, a network perimeter. And if you just secure the perimeter, that is, if you just secure the inputs and outputs from that perimeter, then you are just safe, right? So it might work well in terms of legacy monolith applications where you just have one single point of entry and single point of output, and you just control those. But that does not hold true in a modern architecture, which is, let's say, microservices based, that it's not only north-south communication that comes in and out of the perimeter. There is a lot of east-west communication within the perimeter.
So Abdullah, thanks a lot for joining us. Today we'll talk about a CIO guide for data security, integrity, and confidentiality on cloud environments. So Abdullah, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. So Abdullah, first we'll talk about cloud security postures for secure clouds. Okay. So what does the data in cloud landscape look like today? What are a few things that are driving the need for data security, integrity, and confidentiality in cloud environments?
Right. So increasingly with modern applications and with the advent of course, the public cloud providers and storage options being cheaper and cheaper, the data, there has been a wave of data being moved to the cloud. But with that comes a lot of implications as well. Increasingly, there are a lot of services that cloud providers provide you to do analytics or predictions or modeling on your data. And a lot of the time, these processes are moving closer to the storage. So your data is essentially in the cloud as well. But previously, things that you would just do, for example, for perimeter security, would not really work in terms of data protection, because there is a lot of other things that you have to do in terms of the protection of sensitive data. For example, there could be personally identifiable information out there. There could be payment card industry information. There could be your health information. So consumer data, which is especially sensitive for all of these, requires additional safeguards to be actually protected in the cloud. And data breach for such a sensitive information for actual consumers carries huge risk factors with it. That's why it's essential to have a solid data confidentiality, integrity, and security strategy built into your applications.
Okay, so what frameworks are out there that help you achieve best-in-class cloud security postures for cloud and SaaS environments?
Right. So there are multiple frameworks that exist out there. They are formulated by different organizations. That, for example, there is a PCI, that is payment card industry. So there is a group of organizations with the largest, the top 5 or 6 sort of card providers like Visa, MasterCard. So they came up with these standards, which is essentially PCI DSS, so that the merchants or the service providers that are actually in touch or handling the user information from that payment card transaction, there are a set of steps that you have to take to make sure that that part is totally secure. For example, end-to-end encryption of data at rest, what the access level and controls, who is able to see what data. That's for example, payment cards. Similarly, there's HIPAA that concerns with health-related information. Then there is GDPR, that's essentially the European data protection regulation framework for how to protect consumer data, and so on. SOC, like service organization controls. All of these frameworks have a bunch of requirements and steps that you have to do in order to be considered compliant to be able to build an application that is in that domain.
So Abdullah, how can misconfigurations lead to security compromises, considering that that cloud instances can be compromised by some malicious activity?
Right. This question is really important, especially for the data that contains sensitive information. So we talked about the PII or PHI, right? So the personal consumer information. There have been instances where poorly configured public cloud storage buckets or storage mediums have allowed users to actually download full copies of user information data. So it's increasingly important to have right amount of checks in your environment, especially for things that actually actually store your data, not only from a configuration point of view, but also from an audit point of view. Once you have configured something and you know that this is fine, you have to continuously audit and look for any drift changes as well in those configurations that otherwise might allow someone to compromise that data. So misconfiguration is one of the biggest reasons data breaches occur.
Okay, so building on these misconfigurations and in our attempts to make software development rapid, has the security become an afterthought?
Right. So this is actually, so generally when you talk about the SDLC, right, and so there has been historically friction between the dev teams and the security teams. For example, dev teams might just want to quickly prototype stuff and deploy it to production and see how it goes. And security teams, for example, have an obligation to make sure that whatever is being deployed on a cloud environment or in production has all these safeguards and security measures in place. But increasingly, what has been happening is, for example, security teams may come in with a requirement that your application must have end-to-end encryption, both in transit and then you have encryption at rest as well, which might cause developers to implement additional features to actually achieve that. But the cost of not achieving that is huge at a later stage. So if something is compromised and security becomes an afterthought, then you have to sort of try to repurpose your application to have security built into that. And that might not be a trivial task depending on the complexity of your application. That's why thinking left, shifting to the left and incorporating the security process at the time of the design is essential.
So Abdullah, what does incorporating security in SDLC look like?
Right. So what does SDLC mean? Right? So it essentially means that your application, once it's actually running in production, it is a set of artifacts that are deployed and they work together. And building of those artifacts could be as complex, essentially involving different stages. So you have a design stage, you have a proofread stage, you have a deployment stage, testing stage, validation stage, and all of these different stages of these individual artifacts. And each of those artifacts could be different services. And collectively, when they talk to each other, there is a lot of moving parts that happen. A very common framework that is used in these sort of things is the stride model. So what stride model essentially does is it threat models the application at each of its life cycle. And if you have multiple moving pieces, then you essentially apply a stride model to each of those artifacts. And what does this stride model look like? So stride essentially means spoofing, tampering, so spoofing resistance, which means authentication has to have the right controls, tamper resistance, then repudiation so that non-repudiation can happen. I is essentially information disclosure, that means, and then essentially denial of service and elevation of privileges. These are all models, and there are different tools that exist out there that allow you to actually threat model your application. And if you threat model all of the artifacts of your application that are required to for it to function, then you overall have a stride model, threat model on the whole of your application.
Okay, Abdullah, let's talk about threat intelligence. Okay, so how can a CIO obtain, curate, and act on threat intelligence in more effective ways?
So threat intelligence means having the ability to see the events that are happening in your system, along with the misconfigurations or configurations of different moving parts of your systems. Right? First of all, you need a strategy where you actually have the ability to capture all of those events. In modern times, these are called CM, which is essentially Security Information Event management. What that means is that you have to have a strategy and a bunch of tools and systems to capture all of these events, process them, run them through a set of rule detections. For example, there are tools out there, for example, Datadog. What it allows you to do is run out-of-the-box detection rules on a lot of the security events that happen. It allows you to detect misconfigured instances, and it allows you to detect misconfigured S3 buckets, for example, in case of S3 AWS. And what's more is a lot of these tools are actually derived from NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. They come up with a bunch of guidelines that these are some of the things that you should be looking at when you are actually dealing with data breaches or things of that nature. And those guidelines are the ones that are implemented by these different tools out there, like the Datadog CM or the Sumo Logic CM. And having that robust 360 strategy where you have the ability to not only look for misconfigurations, but also look at the dynamic events that are coming into your system, and having the ability to run those events through a rule engine that allows you to identify which are the events that you really need to take an action on, which could be alerting someone that a breach is about to occur, or which can also lead to automated workflows, ranging from just printing something in the log to an alert, to triggering some remediation, to shutting off things, or paging someone in the middle of the night.
So Abdullah, what is a zero trust architecture?
Okay, so zero trust architecture essentially means that you by default trust no one. What does that mean? What that means is by default, all communication within your services, inbound, outbound, north, south, east, west, is going to be a default deny. And you would only explicitly allow entities that you have a way of establishing their identity and having a configuration or mechanism that actually tells you with sort of authority that this is a communication that you can allow. And that's when you allow that communication. So only trusted entities being able to access something on the basis of established identities is essentially zero trust architecture.
So Abdullah, CIOs are staying up at night facing gaps in privileged identity management. Okay. So what mediation can be done to address this critical issue?
Right. So this builds on the zero trust architecture that we were talking about. So defining a concrete identity and access management strategy is critical for systems that deal with data, especially with systems that deal with sensitive data, because elevation of privilege attacks is one of the most common attacks that can lead to disastrous consequences for this. There are multiple types of elevation privilege attacks. Two of the major ones are essentially the horizontal elevation of privilege, where an attacker gains access to a system and then it can move horizontally to the peers, and then you can go vertical. So you go horizontal and then you find a spot where you can go vertical and you can go all the way up and get root access. That becomes disastrous. That's where the stride model comes in, which we talked about before as well. So if you model your application in the right way, that what are the actors that are going to act on it, how can you properly authenticate, and how can you properly authorize and enforce the things like enforce the principle of least privilege, have audit mechanisms, have insights into who is accessing what, define thresholds and alarms that, okay, if some unauthorized access is happening, do XYZ, remediate things. All of these things in a combination work together to essentially implement a zero trust architecture and minimize the threat of elevation of privilege attacks.
So Abdullah, so startups and SMBs are adopting perimeter model. Maybe you can talk more about it, and how would you convince them that zero trust architecture is the way forward?
Right. So in legacy environments, it was considered enough that you have an application deployed in, let's say, a network perimeter. And if you just secure the perimeter, that is, if you just secure the inputs and outputs from that perimeter, then you are just safe, right? So it might work well in terms of legacy monolith applications where you just have one single point of entry, one single point of output, and you just control those. But that does not hold true in a modern architecture, which is, let's say, microservices based, that it's not only north-south communication that comes in and out of the perimeter. There is a lot of east-west communication within the perimeter, and a lot of the services talk to each other. And especially with this ever-changing landscape of cloud environments with a lot of services, and the perimeter has become porous. So there would be a lot of services interacting with each other to actually enable a business outcome. That's where zero trust architecture comes in, that not only you have to protect the north-south communication, you also have to see what is the patterns of the east-west communication. Do I allow all the other microservices to talk to me, or is it only this particular microservices that can talk to me? That's where the zero trust architecture in a modern way comes into play.
So CIOs and their teams have the issue of alert fatigues, okay, and their teams also. So how do they tackle this issue versus a security or compromising security issues on the other hand?
Right. So that's an interesting question in terms of that there are lots of so if you implement the right observability strategy to get information into the events that are happening into your system, and if you don't have the right detection rules, then yeah, you might get a lot of alerts that might just be false positives. Right? And the way to deal with those things is, first of all, it's really important to contextualize your environment and contextualize the events that you are getting, and have some processing on those events before you actually generate alerts. And increasingly, one of the best ways that we see is to it's a continuously iterative process. So you define a set of rules based on the guidelines, let's say for example for NIST and all these things, and you get the results of those events coming in, and then you continuously audit those environments and you see what is missing. Am I getting too many alerts? Do I need to fine tune some thresholds? You look at historical context. Okay, I got these 4 alerts, but were they correct? Do I need to tighten up my rules a bit more? So all of these things play a part going to and fro to ultimately create the strategy where you avoid the alert fatigue and get actual alerts, where an alert means something really bad has happened.
Okay. So how do CIOs deal with outsourced data integrity and confidentiality?
Right. So this builds on some of the things that we've talked about already. We talked about some of the frameworks that exist out there in terms of protecting your data. Right. So for payment card industry, it's PCI DSS. For health, it's HIPAA. And if you're dealing with that data at your own sort of, let's say, company or organization, you have those controls. You have to implement those controls, and you have to implement those trainings and all those things. But for a lot of the time, companies outsource work as well, where they allow other companies to access the data on their behalf to actually implement some functionalities. So it becomes increasingly important to hold those outsourced, let's say, contractors to the exact same standards, if not stricter standards, than your own organization as well. So if you are, let's say, PCI DSS compliant, and if you're outsourcing that work to someone who is also going to deal with consumer data, then they have to be PCI DSS compliant too. Same with healthcare and other frameworks as well.
Okay, Abdul, let's talk about policies, budgets, and hiring now. Okay, so how do CIOs manage securities across hybrid, on-premise, and multi-cloud and multi-SaaS environments?
Right. So, as you said, so there is increasingly there are environments where essentially the service providers or cloud providers or people who actually deploy their applications use multiple environments to run their applications on. So one quick answer is that you have to implement Stride for each of your environment. But your environment, you have to be context aware of your environment. For example, if you are on cloud, maybe for network protection, you are using, in case of AWS, security groups or firewall in case of GCP. But if your part of your application is maybe on-prem, for example, maybe you're using a third-party firewall solution like a Palo Alto network firewall. So having the awareness of your environment and the modeling of your environment in terms of what are the actors that can act on each of these environments, and what are the actors that can act on these environments when they're trying to communicate to each other, is essential in implementing a robust policy and strategy to secure your heterogeneous environment where your application is deployed.
Okay, so as a CIO, how can I scale security monitoring to deal with increased attack surface and increased sensory coverage? And how do I know if I'm doing enough and my risk profile is about right?
Right. So with increasingly the substrates are getting complex and complex, where your applications are getting deployed, right? So building the right mentality and embedding the security mentality in the SDLC process itself, where you are sort of explicitly trying to shift left, where you are training your people to have the right mindset from security point of view. And that's essentially easier said than done, because there is lots of friction between different teams when they are actually working to get a release out. And at that point, there is always going to be some friction between the security teams. They would not want to get something out unless it has been properly threat modeled or tested. And there is other hand, for example, deadlines in terms of getting the prototype out. So at that point, the implications if something breaks in production is a lot more than, let's say, delaying something to implement additional threat modeling. So for example, creating workflows about, okay, I have built all of this stuff and I just discovered a P0, like a CVSS 10 score vulnerability. What do I do? Do I have a workflow to immediately remediate every P0 vulnerability in my environment? So this includes also a lot of trainings where your employees and your engineers have to be aware that if something like this happens, then everything just has to be stopped and a workflow has to be followed to stop that attack. All right. And in terms of risk profile, so you build all these processes and observability to see what does my security posture look like, what are the insights, what are all the vulnerabilities that are sitting into my system, and then the workflow has to be designed that what you have to do with that. So I have worked with companies and I have worked with customers where people meet on a daily basis or on a weekly basis to review how does my security profile look like, what are the open vulnerabilities out there, what are the total number of P0 vulnerabilities or P1 vulnerabilities, right? What are some of the my SLAs, like do I need to be at 100%? How far am I from that? And you continuously have to audit that, and based on those decisions continuously want to be at that ideal state where you really want to be. And that's where you will continuously improve your risk profile, essentially designing a workflow and mechanism where you continuously audit what is my security profile look like today, where what is the delta to reach to the ideal state, and then taking steps to get to that ideal state.
Budget benchmarking in cloud security, does it lead to more problems than it solves? Would you agree to that? And how CIOs are striking balance between this cost and security?
Right. So this is, you really have to contextualize what is important to you as a business, right? I would argue that the cost of a data breach is orders of magnitude higher than anything that you have to do to actually make sure that your application is deployed in a secure model. You have run the proper stride models on it. You've done the proper threat modeling and pen testing and all that stuff. So I would always argue that the cost spent to implement security is money well spent. In terms of striking the balance, of course, if you have budget constraints, right, you always have to see what are the most vulnerable parts of your system. And once you identify those vulnerable parts of system, you can prioritize based on your budgets that what do you want to fix first. But in an ideal scenario, you would want to fix like most of your vulnerabilities as much as you can. In reality, you always fix the P0 ones, and that's why it's critical to have the workflows, which essentially means the incident response as well, that okay, a P0 vulnerability has been discovered. That is one aspect, how quickly can you fix it? But if it is something that is now a threat where it is actively being exploited in the wild, then you are actually on the clock to fix that ASAP. Otherwise, you are in serious risk of data breaches and things like that.
So Abdullah, there's a gap between demand for IT security professional and its supply. So how are CIOs addressing this talent shortfall issue?
Right, so that's true. There is a lot of shortage in terms of security personnel, especially with this agile environment and cloud environments that involves a lot of moving pieces. So there are areas like DevSecOps appearing, which means incorporating security in your developer operations lifecycle and all that. And a lot of the times, what I have seen is fundamentally, if you have to build and infuse a culture of security in your company within. So from within, what that means is you have to conduct regular trainings highlighting the importance of security, showing the disastrous effects of data breaches that happen in your organization if something bad happens. So training people to have your existing staff up to date with all these security measures is, in my opinion, one of the fundamental ways of infusing an organizational culture and at the same time addressing some of the shortfall of these security professionals. So if you train your people to be security experts at the same time, which is easier said than done, but is one of the critical aspects of implementing all these security frameworks and controls across your organization.